As Zimbabwe buries the man once called the kingmaker, questions arise over the mysterious death of General Solomon Majora. It was he who championed the man who's ended up ruling Zimbabwe for over 3 decades. So who stands to gain from his demise? And does it open any doors in the tightly controlled world of Zimbabwean politics? This is Inside Story. Hello everyone, I'm Kamal Santamaria. When you think Zimbabwe, there really is just one name that comes to mind: Robert Mugabe. But here's another name, Solomon Majora, the man who effectively put Mugabe on the path to the presidency some 36 years ago, and was perhaps that one softer voice within the high ranks of the ruling ZANU-PF party. His funeral took place on Saturday after his death earlier in the week, which is why we're examining his legacy and how his death might change Zimbabwean politics and Zimbabwean life. Regarded as the pioneer behind Zimbabwe's liberation, Solomon Majora was declared a national hero following his death. He was killed in an electrical fire at his farm 60 kilometres south of Harare. And while there's been a bit of conspiracy theory about that particular fire, perhaps the feeling is best summed up by the head of the Defence Force, who said it's hard to comprehend that such a fighter would go in such a way. No doubt he was an influential figure in Zimbabwean politics, but it was his relationship with President Mugabe, both then and now, which takes on even more significance. Here's a little bit more about the man himself. Solomon Majora actually rose to prominence under the nom de guerre or pseudonym of Rex Nhongo. Not only did he persuade the fighters of Zimbabwe's War of Independence to accept Robert Mugabe as their leader, he directed Mugabe's guerrilla forces in that war. After independence in 1980, he became the army chief and a general, position he held to the mid-90s. Politician, businessman as well, he was known as the kingmaker and is said to have been instrumental in Mugabe's rise to power. He was a member of ZANU-PF's Politburo, and his wife, Joyce Mugabe, is one of Zimbabwe's vice presidents. So let's start our conversation off today. Join us from Johannesburg, Heidi Holland, who is a journalist and author of the book Dinner with Mugabe. Thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us today, Heidi. The nature, first of all, of Majora's death, without getting too much into the conspiracy theories, are there reasons to question how and why he died now?
Oh, I would say so, yes. Apart from Zimbabwe having a catastrophic record of political assassinations, Majora's own predecessor died in very mysteriously never resolved circumstances, Josiah Tongagara. The timing in terms of the succession struggle, you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to suspect that there's some foul play involved. Mugabe is not well. I think that even though, again, there are a lot of rumours about that, I think that that's true. You know, people that have observed him in the last few days even report that he's really not looking well. So the stakes are very high at the moment.
And there really is a secession struggle right at the moment? Is struggle the right term?
Well, there always has been, and in the sense that Mugabe has never anointed a successor, and I think he did that deliberately. He played two people off against each other, and oddly enough, they've been the same people for the last 31 years that Mugabe has been in power, and they were Solomon Majora. And the other one is Mnangagwa, the defense minister, Emerson Mnangagwa, fierce rivals, and he's known as the son of God, actually, and Mugabe sort of played one of them against the other ever since he came to power. Now, the fact that one of the deputy presidents is Majora's wife is, of course, very significant. Majora, I think you could argue that Majora was even more influential in Zimbabwe than Mugabe. He was the one person who had a lot of clout with Mugabe, although recently he was said to be very much in favour of a softer approach to politics in Zimbabwe. There's quite a lot of chat that he was engaged with the head of SADC, the regional advisor, in terms of trying to bring democracy to Zimbabwe.
But to be that influential, Heidi, sorry to interrupt you, to be that influential, what is it that he actually did? In the information we put on screen earlier, we were saying how he became an army general, he rose to that position, he stayed there for many years. What was he actually doing right now? Would you call him an advisor, a specialist? What was he doing within ZANU-PF?
Well, no, he was very, very wealthy businessman. He had a major stake in the diamond fields. You know, there was a recent major alluvial diamond find in Zimbabwe, which really changed the stakes as well. And Majora was said to be the head honcho behind the exploitation of those diamond fields. I think the reason he was so influential was, A, he had created Mugabe. He was quite a unifier. He was a very good-looking man. In his early years especially, very physically a very powerful presence. And, you know, he unified the armies prior to independence, including the Rhodesian army. He was able to work with people and persuade people to do things his way. And I think that, as far as I understand it, he was pretty much the eminence grise in the military, even though he was long retired. I think that the generals who are there now mostly owe allegiance to him, in the sense that he was the kingmaker, as I say, not only in a political sense, but in a military sense as well.
So he created Mugabe. I like the way you use that phrase there. He created Mugabe, and he did. He was the one who convinced the fighters that to let Mugabe become the leader effectively. Did that carry on and through their relationship? Obviously, Mugabe owes a lot to him. Were they exceptionally close, even as Mugabe's gone on 30-plus years in power?
Yes, I think they were exceptionally close. But as I say, Mugabe, a wily old fox, didn't want one particular person to think that they were going to succeed him. So he kept them guessing. The fact that Joyce Mugabe was the deputy president was interesting. I mean, for example, Mugabe, I think, was out of the country when Majora died, and Joyce Mugabe was the acting president. I think that gave her an edge if Mugabe had keeled over and died tomorrow, you know. So that might have been one of the factors involved, assuming that his death was not an accident. Mugabe said at his funeral today, as you know, that the death was an accident. So people inside Zimbabwe are being very careful what they say.
I've seen some reports, Heidi, which have painted Solomon Majora as a rival, saying that he was the one who perhaps not just kept President Mugabe in check, but could have rivaled or challenged him. From everything you're saying, that doesn't seem to fit the picture. Where do ideas and reports like that come from, do you think?
No, well, you know what, Solomon Majora, as attractive a person as he was, had a very pronounced speech defect, a stammer. He spoke with an extremely pronounced stammer. So he never sought public office himself, which was the reason that he pushed his wife, who also had very illustrious struggle credentials of her own. She had a profile in her own right. Her name was Spillblood, actually, when she was a guerrilla fighter. But she isn't a powerful person in her own right. So when one's looking to see how Majora's death will affect politics in Zimbabwe, there's a good chance she won't really have the same even though she has a following, that she won't be able to keep her end up, as it were, without him. So, you know, in that sense, the rival Emerson Mnangagwa stands to gain the most from the death of Majora. But I mean, it's also possible that Mugabe, he wasn't close to Majora in the last recent months. And I think one of the reasons was he was trying to make Mugabe retire. And I think he was pushing for a different approach. You know, it may, you know, people get old and they want a decent legacy. Who knows what the reason was? But I would say he was in discussion with the South Africans. Partly that may have been routine, but it may also have been threatening.
Let's just pause for a moment and think more about the party itself, ZANU-PF. Whether you viewed Majora as a rival or an alternative or a right-hand man to Robert Mugabe, his death has got a lot of people talking about the future of ZANU-PF. The main question being, as we've discussed, who would succeed the 87-year-old president? The country's ruling party already suffers from internal power struggles, unable to decide when the election should be held, who should be the actual candidate if they get delayed till 2013? And what of the vice president, as we were talking about with Heidi there, Majora's widow, Joyce? Without his influence political base, will she be left politically weaker? And also, remember the idea of unity. 3 years ago, ZANU-PF signed a so-called power-sharing agreement with the MDC party headed by Morgan Tsvangirai. Solomon Majora was willing to work along those lines of unity, which makes his death a real blow to those within ZANU-PF who supported him and saw him as an alternative to Mugabe's hardline politics. Let's bring another guest into our conversation. In London for us is Jonathan Ofiansa, who's the editor of News Africa magazine. Thanks so much for your time. We're just getting onto the idea of how Majora's death affects ZANU-PF. And the last point I made was about the power-sharing deal, the so-called power-sharing deal with the MDC, the Movement for Democratic Change. When you lose someone like Majora, who championed that, does that kill off any ideas of unity and moving forward along those lines, do you think?
Oh, yes. Majora, as some of us, or you may well know, was one of the few stalwarts within the ZANU-PF who had the courage, to stand up to Robert Mugabe, and also who was trying to court the opposition MDC of Morgan Tsvangirai into forming some sort of a coalition after the elections in 2 years' time. So with his demise, that leaves that possibility of a possible coalition in limbo. Nobody knows what will pan out with his demise.
Does a moderate voice get heard though, Jonathan? I'm trying to imagine that sort of voice and that sort of reasoning actually being heard above the hardliners within ZANU-PF. This deal hasn't worked for the last 3 years, really.
Yes, you see, with this demise also, the other hardliner within the ZANU-PF is Emmerson Mnangagwa, the current defense minister, who is a very, very close ally of Mugabe. He's served Mugabe in various capacities, defense, Speaker of Parliament, Minister for State Security, and is known for his hardline attitudes. So he believes that, so with his Majora's death now, maybe puts Mnangagwa in a very, very strong position. So the MDC, again, might be also at a loss, having lost maybe one moderate voice, within the ZANU-PF, being the late Majora. So it's difficult to actually to see, how things will work out between the short of the MDC winning a very, very big majority in the polls in 2 years' time. It's difficult to see how, things will work out between the two parties, the opposition MDC and the ZANU-PF.
Let's look a bit more at the idea of secession, and we've talked with Heidi Holland about this earlier, and I will go back to her in a moment. But Jonathan, let me stay with you just now, the idea of secession. You've got Joyce Mugabe, the widow of Solomon Majora, who was the vice president. She would obviously succeed President Mugabe in the event of death or abdication. She is the next in line. Would you consider her to be the heir apparent, though? Because often in politics, the person who is actually officially in line to take a position, like the vice president or deputy or whatever you want to call, may not necessarily be the anointed one. Is she such?
I wouldn't say Joyce Mugabe is the anointed one. In any case, Mugabe, being the astute, wily old fox that he is, he's been playing one faction against the other, over the past years. And we shouldn't forget that Joyce Mugabe owes her current position as deputy president of the party and of the state largely to her late husband, Solomon Majora. So with this demise, it puts a big question mark over how Joyce could succeed Mugabe in the event of his moving away, or in any eventuality at all. But we shouldn't forget that there are also other contenders. The current army commander, we have the party chairman, and also the state security minister, in addition to Emmerson Mnangagwa. So it is not a given that if Mugabe is out of the way, or when he's out of the way, Joyce Mugabe will automatically succeed him. In any case, it will all depend on who Mugabe chooses as his successor.
Heidi Holland, let's go back to you there in Johannesburg. What does Joyce Mugabe do now, do you think? She's lost her husband, obviously the man who was such a driving force for her. Does she try to shore up as much support as possible now, given that, as you've pointed out, President Mugabe's an old man now, he's 87 years old. She could be required at any moment.
Yeah, you know, just to go back to the whole succession idea,
sure.
I personally, having studied Mugabe quite closely, don't think Mugabe is concerned about succession at all. I don't think Mugabe intends to step down, step aside, but he will eventually die. So I think that the idea that Mugabe will sooner or later anoint somebody, I don't think that that's true. And so, you know, this ups the stakes in terms of Mrs. Majora has probably really lost ground now. I think that would be a reasonable assumption. She can try to keep it all together, but the eminence grise was her husband, undoubtedly. I mean, it's not her own political power that she's sailing on. Emmerson Mnangagwa is quite a formidable guy, you know, is known to be quite a dangerous man. And yes, there are other contenders, but I would say Mnangagwa is right in the running. But some people talk, and have been for a while actually, even before this, about the generals getting very restless. The generals are much more outspoken than they used to be, you know. The generals are very socially prominent, you know, even their wives are seem to be well known these days in Zimbabwe. So people are not ruling out even a coup, you know, a sort of peremptory action by the generals themselves. So I think this is why people are so worried about the stability of Zimbabwe now. You know, this is a dangerous situation.
Well, I'm glad you used the word stability, because I was going to ask you, does Solomon Majora's death create enough instability for anyone to make a tilt at the leadership, or is the idea of making a tilt at Robert Mugabe and trying to take advantage of such a situation, is that a step too far?
You know, one of the reasons that ZANU-PF was so keen to push the election for this year, which is not now going to happen, was because Mugabe is getting more and more fragile, you know, and taking on an election is a major job for an old man like that, and he's not well, he's ill. So the feeling in ZANU-PF by the sort of hawks, if you like, was let's get him in again for another term, shore him up, and that'll solve the immediate problem, because there is the succession problem. However, the regional body, SADC, which notionally at any rate is kind of in charge of the unity government there, headed by our president, Jacob Zuma, have got tougher with ZANU-PF lately, at last. And they are actually trying to demand that they meet some of the requirements for an election. And that's one of the frustrating elements. And I think that that could be a trigger in this whole thing. If they're now talking about an election in 2 years' time, well, Mugabe certainly won't be there to fight that election. And as you mentioned earlier, you know, perhaps that creates a sort of atmosphere for a free-for-all now. I mean, what are they going to wait for, you know?
Heidi, Jonathan, there's one more thing I'd like to look at, because we're talking about a man, a president, a political party, but in the end, for Zimbabwe, this is about the people of the country, I think, and who that government should be serving. Now, without indulging myself too much here, I was in Zimbabwe 2008 for the elections, and I remember seeing the bread queues right around the block, and the $10 million notes, and no water on the shelves, and a real lack of hope amongst all those people there. Never sort of forget those sorts of things. Jonathan, if I start with you, can politics change Zimbabwe? We've seen a unity government, so-called unity government, for 3 years, and I doubt things have improved that much for them.
Yes, I mean, nothing is set in stone. There are dynamics, in any given situation, and being dynamics, they are not static. So yes, politics will definitely change in Zimbabwe. Mugabe isn't going to be president forever, like my colleague, other lady said. He's well, he's ill, and the likelihood of him maybe being able to run for the elections in 2 years' time looks a bit slim. Okay, so with him out of the way, even look, Majora is dead. Majora was trying to impress upon Mugabe to stand down. Now he is out of the way, so that shows some fluidity in the system. Now things are going to change. I mean, either Mugabe names a successor, there will be jostling for positions and all that. Definitely, the situation will move on. Elections come on in 2 years' time. Whoever wins will indicate a shift from what we have today and from what we had in yesteryears. Yes, so yes, definitely, politics in Zimbabwe will change. And I believe, in my opinion, it will change for the better.
Heidi, your thoughts? Can politics help? I mean, it hasn't arguably helped much in the last few years, in the last few decades. Arguably, what did help for Zimbabwe was a battle some 30-odd years ago, which got them their independence. Now, I'm not advocating anything here, obviously, but what could work for the people there?
No, its history is incredibly violent, and its violence has never been dealt with. You know, I mean, the violence of the Bush War, the violence of Ian Smith, the White Rhodesians and so on. But one thing I would say to you, Kamal, which I think people don't take into account enough, is a quarter of the Zimbabwe population, at least, are in the diaspora. They're down here in the streets of Joburg and South African cities. Let's say half the population is under the voting age, which wouldn't be a bad estimate. It means in a population of 12 million, ZANU-PF only has to control effectively 3 million people, you know. This is one of the problems in Zimbabwe, quite frankly, is the extent of the migration out of Zimbabwe. So, you know, this is yet another factor. It's not very difficult to control 3 million people. Mugabe has chosen to do it through violence largely because you know, because he's not popular enough to be voted in again. And ZANU-PF is a very divided party. So I think the country is in deep trouble now, really.
And what do you think a Zimbabwe without ZANU-PF would be like? If I go back again, say the elections last time, there was a feeling that change could have happened. If it was going to happen, it was going to happen then. And people were thinking, well, you know, how will our lives change if there's no ZANU-PF, or there's a ZANU-PF not in power in Zimbabwe? Surely that could be a more positive turn for them.
Yeah, well, you know, one of the things that has happened when you say, can politics change things, one of the things that has happened, unfortunately, is that the opposition MDC, who were really very strong at one point, got into bed with Mugabe, and that has been a real problem, and it remains a problem. It's one of the reasons that prior to the death of Majora, Zimbabwe went completely out of the headlines for several years. I mean, nobody knew, you know, how to intervene there. And as I say, with this mass migration of people from Zimbabwe, it's pretty difficult to see where the pressure for democracy is going to come from. You know, our own SADC, our own leaders, Jacob Zuma, has not functioned any more effectively than his predecessor Thabo Mbeki did to put the screws on ZANU-PF to get on with the democratic process. And Zimbabwe is a million miles away, in my opinion, from democracy right now.
Heidi Holland, it's been great talking to you. Thank you for your time, and also to Jonathan Ofiansa joining us for News Africa magazine there in London. Thanks to both of you, really appreciate it. And to you, our viewers, thank you for joining us for Inside Story. If you've got a comment or a suggestion for a future show or this show, email it into us, won't you? InsideStory@aljazeera.net is our email address. From the whole team, it's goodbye for now.